A crack, sharp and sudden as rifle fire, echoed across the empty plains, but it was no rifle. It was bone. Her bone. Sarah's world instantly shattered into a universe of white-hot, blinding agony. Her horse, Dusty, a trusted friend, crashed down with sickening force, his entire weight a crushing mountain, grinding her leg into the unforgiving Texas earth. Trapped, broken, each ragged, desperate breath she tore into her lungs felt like swallowing fire and shards of glass. Dust filled her nostrils, thick with the coppery tang of her own blood. Then, as her vision swam, a shadow blotted out the merciless, indifferent sun. A figure emerged from the shimmering heat haze, materializing as if from the very dust itself, tall, lean, silent as death. A feathered lance, its sharpened point glinting malevolently, was held steady in his grip. A Comanche warrior, his face a terrifying mask of ochre and black paint, his eyes like chips of obsidian, cold and unreadable. Her leg had snapped clean in two beneath her fallen horse, and now, utterly helpless, she was at the profound and absolute mercy of a man whose people were her people's bitterest, most feared foes. Would he offer the cold comfort of a swift end, or was she destined for a slow, terrifying ordeal beyond her darkest imaginings? The answer lay hidden behind those impenetrable obsidian eyes, an answer that would not only decide her immediate fate, but would also shatter every notion she had ever held about survival, about savagery, and about the true, untamed heart of this brutal, beautiful frontier. Sarah had painstakingly carved a small, lonely piece of existence for herself on the raw, untamed edge of the settled territories. Her home was a humble sod-roofed cabin, little more than a burrow against the elements, accompanied by a stubbornly struggling patch of corn and a modest corral that held Dusty. Dusty, her sole, steadfast companion since the before times. Before the quiet, gnawing grief for a life lost had propelled her westward, a solitary woman seeking a fragile solace in the vast, uncaring emptiness of the plains. She was no wilting flower, no damsel easily cowed by hardship. Life, in its relentless cruelty, had taught her young that overt fear was a dangerous luxury, an indulgence she could ill afford. Her hands, though roughened and calloused from the endless toil of hoeing stubborn earth and hauling precious water, were remarkably steady when she sighted down the barrel of her late father's old, reliable rifle. She possessed skills born of necessity. She could track game with a quiet patience, dress a deer with practiced efficiency, and read the shifting moods of the sky for subtle weather signs with an accuracy that surpassed many men who loudly boasted of their frontier prowess. This quiet, understated competence was her armor, a shield forged in the fires of past sorrows and present dangers. She had learned through bitter experience to observe the world with an almost preternatural keenness, to listen intently to the loaded silences that fell between the mournful yelps of distant coyotes and the almost imperceptible rustle of unseen creatures moving through the tall, whispering grass. It was a profound watchfulness, an instinct honed from a past she never, ever spoke of, a shadowed time when missing a subtle, dangerous shift in a man's eyes, or the almost imperceptible tightening of a hand near a weapon, could mean the stark difference between fragile safety and something far worse. Her small, isolated homestead was her desperate bid for peace, a lonely sanctuary where the haunting ghosts of yesterday might. She prayed, finally quiet their incessant, mournful clamor. But even in this self-imposed isolation, an undeniable tension hummed constantly beneath the deceptive surface of prairie stillness. The land itself was a relentless, indifferent adversary, parching droughts that cracked the earth, sudden, violent storms that could flatten her precious corn in minutes, and the ever-present, lurking threat of predators, both the four-legged kind that slunk through the night and the more dangerous two-legged variety that roamed the lawless territories. And then there were the stories, dark tales whispered like furtive prayers around rare, flickering campfires, or exchanged in hushed tones in the dusty, cluttered general store, a long day's ride away, chilling stories of violent clashes, of brutal raids, of an unyielding, bitter hatred that festered between settler and native. She consciously tried to push these grim narratives aside, forcing her focus onto the tangible, the turning of the stubborn earth with her spade, the necessary mending of a weathered fence rail, the comforting, quiet nicker of Dusty in the cool, gray light of dawn. Yet, despite her best efforts, her eyes always scanned the distant horizon, a deeply ingrained habit, a sentinel's watchfulness now too much a part of her to ever break. She knew the local tribes, the Comanche foremost among them, generally kept to their own territories further south and west, but their hunting parties, driven by need, sometimes ranged far and wide. She had seen their distant, cryptic smoke signals, painting ephemeral messages against the vast canvas of the sky, had felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the prairie's unique energy, a kind of thrumming awareness when they were near. It wasn't precisely fear she felt in those moments, not the heart-pounding terror of imminent attack, more a deep, primal awareness, a solemn recognition of another, older way of life that existed perilously alongside her own fragile existence, largely indifferent to her small dreams of ripening corn and quiet, undisturbed solitude. She moved through her solitary days with a controlled, deliberate economy of motion, her face often an unreadable mask, a calm, still surface concealing a mind that was perpetually calculating, ceaselessly assessing potential threats and shifting odds. This profound quietness about her was not passivity. It was a finely tuned instrument of survival, a razor-sharp edge honed by trials she carried within her like invisible, aching scars. That particular morning had dawned with a brassy, unforgiving sun already climbing a vast sky the faded, washed-out color of old denim. Sarah had ridden out early, as was her habit, to check the few rabbit snares she maintained along the winding, Willowchoke Creek bed, a small, routine task that usually brought with it a measure of quiet calm, a brief respite from the constant undercurrent of watchfulness. Dusty, her sturdy gelding, seemed in good spirits, his gait easy and familiar beneath her, a comforting rhythm in the otherwise silent landscape. The air was heavy still, holding the oppressive promise of a truly scorching day ahead. Her thoughts, perhaps, had wandered a little too far inward. She'd been preoccupied with the dwindling level in her sack of flour, the looming necessity of making the arduous, multi-day trip to the distant settlement soon, a journey she always undertook with a tight, persistent knot of unease churning in her stomach, for the trail was long and dangers, both seen and unseen, were many. They were cutting across a wide, deceptively smooth stretch of open prairie, the native grasses growing tall and thick, high enough to conceal a lurking man, or, as it tragically turned out, a deep, sun-baked, and wickedly hidden prairie dog burrow. Dusty's left foreleg plunged into the unseen cavity without the slightest warning. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated terror and agony that ripped through the morning stillness, tearing at Sarah's own nerves. She felt the world tilt violently, the horizon spinning in a dizzying, sickening arc as Dusty went down, heavily, catastrophically, on his side. She'd instinctively tried to kick her leg free of the stirrup, to throw herself clear, but it was all too fast, too sudden, too brutally violent. A sound like a thick, dry branch snapping sharply underfoot echoed horrifically in her ears, a sound she dimly, terrifyingly recognized as her own tibia parting ways with its other half. Then came the weight, immense, suffocating, and unyielding, as Dusty's massive body pinned her right leg, from thigh to ankle, to the unforgiving, sun-baked earth. Pain white-hot, blinding, and absolute, seared through her consciousness like a branding iron. She cried out, a raw, involuntary, animal sound of pure torment that was instantly swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains. Dusty thrashed wildly for a terrifying moment, his own panic and agony adding immeasurably to her torment. Then, with a shuddering groan, lay still, his great sides heaving, his soft, intelligent eyes wide with fear and pain. Sarah gasped for air, fighting back waves of intense nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Her vision tunneled, darkening at the edges. The acrid taste of dust filled her mouth, and she could smell the coppery, metallic scent of her own blood, a warm trickle escaping from a fresh gash on her temple where her head had struck the ground. She tried to shift, to push, to somehow writhe free, but the horse was an immovable mountain of flesh and bone, and every tiny, desperate movement sent fresh, incandescent shards of agony lancing through her shattered leg. It was trapped. Badly, horribly trapped. Broken. She was absolutely, terrifyingly sure of it. The bone, she could feel its jagged, sharp ends grating sickeningly against each other with every shallow, panicked breath she took. Panic, cold, sharp, and debilitating, clawed at her throat like an icy hand. She was miles from her small, isolated cabin, miles from any conceivable source of help. No one knew precisely where she'd gone that morning. No one would even think to look for her until nightfall, and perhaps, realistically, not even then. Tears of sheer frustration, helplessness, and unbearable agony welled in her eyes, blurring the already hazy, indifferent landscape. She fought them back fiercely, biting down hard on her lower lip until she tasted blood. This was no time for weeping, she told herself sternly. This was a time for what? She didn't know. She was utterly, terrifyingly, and completely helpless. And then, through the shimmering, dancing heat haze that rose from the parched earth, a figure materialized. Not walking, but flowing, moving with an eerie grace, as if he were an intrinsic part of the prairie itself. He moved with a profound, unnerving silence that was somehow more menacing than any blood-curdling war cry. Closer he came, and closer, until he stood a mere 10 feet away, his tall frame blocking the harsh glare of the sun, casting her into sudden, chilling shadow. The Comanche warrior, his eyes, dark, deep-set, and utterly unreadable, took in the entire scene with a slow, meticulous scan. The fallen, suffering horse, its labored, shallow breathing. Her pinned, bleeding, undeniably helpless. He held that feathered lance, its point wickedly sharp and glinting ominously, and a powerful bow was slung across his broad, muscular shoulders. His expression didn't change by so much as a flicker. Not a hint of surprise, or pity, or even overt aggression. Just observation. Cold, detached, meticulous observation. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a terrified, trapped bird. This was the moment all the whispered, fearful stories had warned about. She was a settler, a woman alone, grievously injured prey. The warrior's intense gaze lingered on Dusty first, a long, slow, assessing look that seemed to take in every detail of the horse's plight. He took a single, deliberate step closer, his worn moccasined feet making absolutely no discernible sound on the dry, cracked earth. Sarah held her breath, every nerve ending in her body, screaming in a silent chorus of fear and pain. He then shifted his unwavering attention to her trapped leg, his dark eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. She could see the intricate, symbolic patterns of his tribal paint, the stark contrasts of ochre and black, the way a single, perfectly shaped hawk feather was skillfully braided into his long, dark hair. He was lean, almost gaunt, but there was a tightly coiled, formidable power in his stillness that spoke volumes of a life lived constantly on the razor's edge of survival. His silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. She knew she had to do something, say something. But what words could possibly reach him? Begging for her life would likely be useless, she reasoned grimly, perhaps even invite contempt or hasten her demise. She thought, with a pang of despair, of her rifle, securely strapped to Dusty's saddle, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly out of reach. Useless. Her voice a dry, rasping croak. She managed to force out the words, telling him that her leg was broken. The warrior's eyes flicked briefly to her face, then returned to her mangled leg. He made no outward sign that he understood her words, or, if he did, that he cared in the slightest. He simply watched, his stillness more unnerving than any overt threat. Sarah, despite the crushing, unrelenting pain and the raw terror that threatened to completely paralyze her, felt a faint, stubborn flicker of that old, deeply ingrained watchfulness. She studied him in turn, her mind racing. He wasn't heavily laden with weaponry, just the lance and the bow. He looked more like a lone hunter, she thought, than a member of a war party out for blood. There was no discernible bloodlust in his eyes, no savage glee, just an unnerving, profound calm. He took another silent step, then knelt gracefully beside Dusty's bowed head, his movements fluid and strikingly economical. He carefully laid his lance on the parched ground beside him. Sarah's heart gave a sudden, hopeful leap. Was this a sign? A prelude to mercy? Or merely a practical measure before what? He murmured something soft and low to the suffering horse, in a flowing, guttural language she didn't understand, a language that sounded as ancient as the wind itself. Dusty, surprisingly, seemed to quiet a little under his voice, his ragged breathing easing almost imperceptibly. The warrior ran a hand gently, almost tenderly, down the horse's sweat-slicked, trembling neck. Then he turned back to Sarah. He pointed to her trapped leg, then to the massive bulk of the horse. He made a distinct lifting motion with his powerful hands, then grunted, a short, questioning sound. She understood his meaning instantly. He was asking if she could somehow assist in lifting the horse, or if he should attempt to move the animal himself. She shook her head weakly, the effort sending fresh waves of dizziness through her, telling him she couldn't, that it was far too heavy for her, broken as she was. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully, as if merely confirming his own prior assessment. He rose to his feet, and for a single, terrifying, heart-stopping moment, Sarah was utterly convinced he was going to leave her there. Simply walk away and let the unforgiving prairie claim her. Let the scavengers pick her bones clean under the blazing sun. But instead, he walked slowly around the fallen horse, his keen eyes studying the angle of the fall, the precise way she was pinned beneath its crushing weight. He prodded Dusty's hindquarters gently with the toe of his moccasin. The horse groaned in response, but didn't shift its position significantly. The warrior seemed to be calculating, weighing unseen options in his mind. He glanced up at the vast, empty sky, as if seeking guidance, then back at Sarah. His expression remained utterly impassive, unreadable, but she thought, or perhaps desperately hoped, she saw a flicker of something in their dark depths. Not pity, not yet, but perhaps decision. He retrieved his lance from the ground. Sarah's breath caught painfully in her throat. He approached her side of the horse again. He wasn't looking at her face now, but intently at the point where her leg disappeared beneath Dusty's heavy flank. He used the blunt, wooden end of the lance to probe gently, carefully, around the trapped area. Each touch, however light, sent fresh, excruciating jolts of agony shooting up her leg, into her very core. She clenched her teeth, so hard her jaw ached, fiercely stifling a cry of pain. He was clearly trying to ascertain how badly she was trapped, how much of the horse's dead weight was directly on the shattered bone, how best to approach the problem. This methodical, silent examination went on for what felt like an agonizing eternity. His focused, almost clinical assessment was, in its own way, almost worse than immediate, brutal violence would have been. The gnawing uncertainty was a torment all its own. Finally, he straightened up. He looked directly into her eyes, a gaze so intense it felt as though he could see into her very soul. He said nothing, not a single word, but there was a new, undeniable resolve etched on his painted face now. He was going to do something. What, she couldn't begin to guess. But the cold, paralyzing dread that had gripped her was now strangely mixed with a tiny, desperate, flickering spark of anticipation? Or was it merely a different, more focused kind of fear? The Comanche warrior Kael, as she would later come to know his name in the silent, unspoken language of shared hardship and mutual survival, moved with a sudden, focused purpose that was both deeply frightening and, in a strange, contradictory way, a little bit reassuring. He wasn't abandoning her to her fate. He first went to Dusty, speaking to him again in those low, soothing, guttural tones that seemed to calm the suffering animal. He stroked the horse's muzzle with a calloused hand, then, with a surprising gentleness that belied his fierce appearance, he carefully examined Dusty's own badly injured foreleg. The horse whinnied softly, a low, mournful sound of pain and, perhaps, a dawning trust. Kael's face remained an unreadable mask, but his touch on the animal was unexpectedly careful, almost tender. After a long, silent moment of assessment, he straightened, a grim, resolute set to his jaw. He seemed to make a silent decision about the horse, a decision whose meaning Sarah couldn't yet decipher. Then he turned his full, intense attention back to her. He motioned for her to try and pull her leg free, a slight, upward tugging gesture with his hands. Sarah braced herself, drawing a ragged breath, gritted her teeth against the anticipated agony, and pulled. The pain was a blinding, nauseating, all-consuming wave. A strangled, half-formed scream escaped her lips, torn from her involuntarily. She couldn't move it, not even an inch. The jagged ends of bone grated hideously against each other, and she nearly fainted from the sheer, overwhelming intensity of the sensation. Kael watched her futile effort, his dark, perceptive eyes missing nothing. He shook his head slightly, a minute gesture, as if to convey that he had expected as much. He then began to gather rocks, medium-sized, sun-baked stones, from the surrounding prairie, his movements quick and efficient. He piled them methodically near Dusty's broad back. Sarah watched him, mystified, her fear ratcheting up another notch. What terrible plan was he formulating now? He gestured again, this time for her to brace herself, to prepare for something. Then he positioned himself at Dusty's hindquarters, his back to her. He began to push, using his powerful shoulder for leverage, his leg muscles straining visibly beneath his buckskins. Dusty groaned, a deep, pitiful sound, scrambling feebly with his good legs, trying to assist. The horse shifted, just an inch, then another. Each tiny movement, each fractional adjustment of weight, sent fresh, unholy torment lancing through Sarah's trapped limb. She cried out again, unable to stop herself this time, the sounds raw and animalistic. Kael didn't pause, didn't react to her cries. He was utterly focused, his muscles bunched and straining, sweat beginning to gleam on his coppery, sun-darkened skin. He was attempting to create a small space, a lever point. He grunted with the immense effort, pushing with all his might, then quickly, skillfully wedged one of the rocks he'd gathered under Dusty's heavy flank, trying to take some of the direct, crushing pressure off her leg. It was an agonizingly slow, brutal process, inch by painful, torturous inch. Sarah's vision was blurring, the world around her swimming in a haze of pain. The sun beat down mercilessly, a fiery hammer from the brassy sky. Thirst was a burning, rasping coal in her parched throat. She felt herself starting to slip away, the overwhelming pain threatening to drag her down into blessed unconsciousness. She gasped out, not sure if she was speaking to him or to herself, a desperate plea not to stop, not to give up. He heard her, or perhaps he just knew. With that primal instinct of his, he redoubled his efforts, a renewed urgency in his movements. He managed to wedge another rock into place, then a third, creating a tiny, precarious fulcrum. He then moved swiftly to her side. He looked down at her mangled leg, then searchingly at her face. He pointed to her leg, then made a sharp, decisive pulling gesture. He was going to pull her free. Now, the thought sent a fresh, visceral wave of pure terror surging through her. This would be agony beyond imagining, beyond anything she had ever endured. But what other choice did she have? Lie here until the merciless sun cooked her alive, or until the wolves, drawn by the scent of blood and suffering, came for her in the night? She nodded, a jerky, desperate, almost convulsive movement, her hands clenched into tight fists, her nails digging painfully into the dusty, unforgiving ground. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable, horrific pain. Kael grasped her ankle, his grip surprisingly firm, but not crushing, his calloused skin unexpectedly warm against hers. She could feel the steady heat of his hand through the torn fabric of her denims. He said something then, a single, sharp, guttural word in his own tongue. Perhaps it was a warning. Perhaps it was an encouragement. She would never know. Then he pulled. It wasn't a sudden, violent yank, but a strong, steady, relentless traction. The sound of grating bone was sickeningly, horrifyingly loud in her ears, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. Pain exploded behind her eyes, a red, searing supernova of pure sensation. She screamed a long, raw, piercing sound that tore from the very depths of her soul, echoing out across the silent plains. The world went utterly black for a moment, then swam dizzily, nauseatingly back into a wavering, distorted focus. But she was free. Her leg was out from under the horse. It lay twisted at a grotesque, unnatural angle, bleeding freely, covered in dirt, sweat, and horsehair, but was undeniably, blessedly free. Sarah lay panting, trembling uncontrollably from head to toe, teetering on the very brink of unconsciousness. Kael was kneeling beside her, his broad chest heaving slightly from the tremendous exertion. He looked down at her mangled, bleeding leg, then at her pale, sweat-streaked face. His expression was still largely unreadable, a stoic mask, but there was something different in his eyes now. A faint, fleeting flicker of something akin to grim, hard-won satisfaction. Or perhaps, just the detached acknowledgement of a difficult, necessary task finally completed. He had not killed her. He had, against all odds, freed her. But the prairie stretched around them, vast, empty, and indifferent, and she was crippled, helpless. The sun climbed ever higher, a merciless, glaring eye in the vast, empty sky. What, she wondered with a fresh surge of dread, would he do with her now? Kael didn't linger over his success. He moved with an ingrained efficiency. From a worn leather pouch at his hip, he produced a small, crudely made waterskin, uncorked it with his teeth, and without a word, held it to Sarah's dry, cracked lips. The water was lukewarm from the sun, but it was the most wonderful, life-giving thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, desperately, some of it spilling down her chin and onto her dusty blouse. He let her drink her fill, his dark eyes watching her intently, then carefully stoppered the skin and returned it to his pouch. His movements were economical, precise, devoid of any wasted motion or superfluous gesture. He looked at her shattered leg again, his brow furrowed in a slight frown of concentration. It was a terrible sight, already swollen to twice its normal size, grotesquely discolored with angry bruises, the bone clearly, badly shattered. He then scanned the distant horizon, a slow, deliberate, sweeping gaze, as if meticulously checking for unseen watchers, for any sign of danger. Satisfied, or perhaps just resignedly accepting the inherent risks of their exposed position, he turned back to her. He pointed to her injured leg, then made a clear gesture of wrapping or binding. He then looked around the immediate area, his eyes searching, as if looking for something specific. His gaze landed on a small, dense thicket of wiry, resilient bushes a short distance away. He rose silently and walked towards them, his lance still held firmly in his hand. Sarah watched him go, a confusing, turbulent maelstrom of fear and a dawning, incredibly fragile hope churning within her. He wasn't acting like a savage captor from the terrifying fireside stories. His actions, so far, had been unexpectedly practical, almost helpful, if one could somehow ignore the terrifying, overwhelming context of her situation. He returned shortly, carrying several relatively straight, sturdy branches he had broken off with his bare hands. He also carried his knife, a long, wickedly sharp blade that glinted ominously in the harsh sunlight. Sarah's heart constricted for a terrifying moment, a cold fist of dread squeezing her chest, but he didn't even glance at her with any hint of menace. He sat down on the ground beside her injured leg and, with deft, practiced movements, began to strip the smaller twigs and leaves from the branches he had gathered. He was fashioning splints. Crude, makeshift, but splints nonetheless. The process of setting her leg, even in this rudimentary, frontier way, was another harrowing journey into the depths of agony. He was, however, surprisingly gentle, his hands firm and steady as he carefully, methodically tried to align the broken ends of the bone. Sarah bit down hard on a folded piece of thick leather he'd silently given her from his pouch, muffling her agonized cries, the taste of salt and leather filling her mouth. Tears streamed freely down her dirt-streaked face, unheeded, unchecked. He worked quickly, efficiently, his painted face a mask of intense concentration. He used long, thin strips of rawhide he produced from another hidden pouch to bind the newly fashioned splints tightly around her leg, immobilizing it as best he could under the circumstances. When he was finally done, beads of sweat glistened on his high forehead. He looked critically at his handiwork, then searchingly at Sarah. Her leg throbbed with a fiery, intense, pulsating pain, but it was a contained pain now, a focused agony, not the loose, grating, sickening torment of before. He then turned his attention back to the fallen Dusty. He walked slowly, deliberately around the suffering horse, examining him closely from every angle. Dusty whinnied again, a low, pleading, mournful sound that tore at Sarah's heart. Kael knelt by the horse's bowed head, murmuring to him again in those soft, incomprehensible sounds. After a long, silent moment, he stood. His face was grim, his jaw set in a hard line. He picked up his lance. Sarah watched, her breath catching painfully in her throat, her heart sinking with a terrible certainty. She knew what was coming. She closed her eyes tightly, unable, unwilling, to witness it. There was a single, sharp, choked-off sound from the horse, a sound of finality, then silence. A heavy, profound, echoing silence that seemed to settle over the plains like a shroud. When she dared to open her eyes again, Kael was standing over Dusty's still form, his expression unreadable, remote. He had ended the horse's suffering. It was a mercy she knew, a hard, brutal mercy of the frontier. But the sight of Dusty, so still, so utterly lifeless, her faithful companion for so long, sent a fresh, desolating wave of despair washing through her. He was her last tangible link to her old life, to any semblance of safety or familiarity. Kael didn't pause for sentiment, for grief. He efficiently retrieved her rifle from Dusty's saddle, and the small, worn saddlebag that contained her meager supplies, a little dry jerky, a dented tin cup, a few hard biscuits. He slung her rifle over his own shoulder, then expertly tied the saddlebag to his belt. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. He pointed towards the low, distant, hazy hills to the west. Then he pointed to himself, then to her, and made a clear, unmistakable gesture of carrying, of transporting. He was going to take her. But where? And more importantly, why? The sun was beginning its slow, majestic descent towards the western horizon, painting the vast, cloudless sky in breathtaking hues of fiery orange, deep crimson, and soft purple. The air was beginning to cool, but the profound chill Sarah felt had little to do with the approaching evening breeze. It was the deep, penetrating chill of the unknown, of being utterly, terrifyingly dependent on a man who was, by all rights, her sworn enemy. He fashioned a crude but effective travois from his own lance and a couple of the sturdier branches he'd collected, lashing them together with more strips of tough rawhide. He then carefully, almost gently, lifted her onto it. The movement, despite his care, was jarring, and she cried out involuntarily, but he was as gentle as the harsh circumstances allowed. Then he began to pull, leaning into the considerable weight, his powerful legs eating up the rough, uneven ground with a steady, relentless rhythm. The journey that followed was a nightmarish blur of searing pain, constant jolting movement, and a deepening, bone-weary exhaustion. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a hazy, shifting landscape of suffering. Each bump, Each unseen rock, each jarring dip in the terrain sent agonizing shockwaves through her broken, splintered leg. Kael moved with a steady, seemingly tireless pace, never speaking, his keen eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. As deep darkness finally fell, blanketing the plains, he found a shallow, sheltered draw, protected from the wind by a few stunted, resilient juniper trees. He lowered the travois gently to the ground. He then built a small, remarkably smokeless fire, using skills Sarah, even in her dazed state, could only marvel at. He shared a piece of his own stringy, dried meat with her, and more precious water. They sat in a heavy, loaded silence, the only sounds the soft crackle and hiss of the small fire, and the distant, mournful howl of a lone coyote, a sound that seemed to underscore their isolation. Sarah watched him across the flickering flames, his powerful silhouette stark and imposing against the firelight. Who was this enigmatic man? Why was he doing this? Every instinct she possessed, every fearful story she'd ever heard, every ingrained prejudice screamed that he should have left her for the buzzards, or far, far worse. Yet here she was alive, her broken leg splinted and tended, sharing his meager fire, his precious water. The vast, untamed wilderness stretched out around them, immense, silent, and profoundly indifferent to her fate. Her fear was still there, a cold, tight knot in the pit of her stomach, but something else was beginning to stir within her now, a reluctant, bewildering, and deeply unsettling sense of gratitude, and an even more bewildering, burgeoning curiosity about the silent warrior who held her life in his calloused hands. Days blurred into a grueling, monotonous rhythm of jolting, painful travel and brief, exhausted, fitful rests. Kael pushed onward relentlessly, his endurance seemingly limitless, his pace unwavering. He changed the crude dressing on her leg regularly, using crushed green leaves he gathered from unseen places, leaves that surprisingly soothed some of the inflammation, binding them with fresh strips of pliable hide. His touch, when he tended to her, was unexpectedly careful, almost delicate for such a formidable-looking man. He hunted, silently and efficiently, like a ghost moving through the land, bringing back a lean rabbit once, which he expertly skinned and cooked over another small, smokeless fire, fairly sharing the meager, precious portions. Sarah tried to speak to him a few times during those long days, uttering simple words, asking tentative questions, but he rarely responded beyond a non-committal grunt or a subtle gesture. His silence was a formidable wall, an impenetrable barrier, yet his consistent actions spoke a language all their own, a stark language of grim determination, incredible resilience, and an unexpected, almost unbelievable thread of care. She gradually learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his dark eyes constantly, restlessly scanned the terrain, missing nothing. He was always alert, always watchful, a silent, vigilant guardian. Her initial, paralyzing terror had slowly, almost imperceptibly, subsided, replaced by a weary, resigned acceptance of her situation and a growing, unspoken, and deeply unsettling reliance on this stoic, enigmatic Comanche. She found herself observing him intently, studying the way he moved with such fluid grace, the way he seemed to be an intrinsic, harmonious part of the harsh landscape itself, rather than an intruder upon it. There was an undeniable, quiet dignity about him, a profound, inherent strength that had absolutely nothing to do with the savage portrayals from her childhood stories. One evening, as a spectacular, blood-red sun bled slowly into the bruised purple of the western horizon, they reached a place unlike any they had sheltered in before. It was a small, perfectly hidden canyon, almost a deep cleft carved into the ancient rock, with a tiny, clear spring seeping miraculously from a stone wall, creating a startling, vibrant patch of lush green in the otherwise arid, desolate landscape. A few ancient, gnarled cottonwood trees grew there, their leaves whispering softly in the faint, cooling breeze. It felt secluded, hidden, safe. Kael gently lowered the travois to the soft earth. He didn't build a fire immediately this time. Instead, He walked silently towards the back of the narrow, shadowy canyon, disappearing abruptly behind a thick, concealing curtain of old, dry vines that clung tenaciously to the sheer rock face. Sarah waited, her heart pounding a nervous tattoo against her ribs. Was this it? Was this the place where he would finally? Her anxious thoughts were abruptly interrupted when he reappeared from behind the vines. He beckoned her forward with a slight inclination of his head. Hesitantly, using a sturdy branch he had earlier given her as a makeshift crutch, she hobbled slowly after him, her splinted legs stiff, throbbing, and aching with every difficult step. Behind the concealing screen of vines was a shallow cave, not large by any means, but perfectly dry and well sheltered from the elements. The air inside was noticeably cooler, a welcome relief from the day's oppressive heat, and it was immediately, abundantly clear that Kael had been here before many times. There was a neat, carefully stacked pile of dry firewood in one corner, a few smooth, flat stones arranged as a rudimentary hearth, and even a couple of surprisingly soft, worn-looking animal furs spread upon the cave floor. This was one of his places, a personal refuge, a hidden sanctuary. He helped her settle onto one of the soft furs, then went to fetch fresh water from a spring in a small, skillfully woven water basket she hadn't seen before. When he returned, he didn't offer her the water immediately. He knelt before her on the cave floor, and for the very first time since she had encountered him, his stern expression seemed to soften, just a fraction, around his eyes and mouth. He reached out a hand slowly, hesitantly, and gently, almost reverently, touched the side of her face, where a dark, fading bruise from the fall was still visible. His touch was surprisingly light, unexpectedly tender. Then he spoke, his voice low, guttural, the first real words he directed at her beyond monosyllabic grunts or single, sharp commands. His English was heavily accented, broken, but the words were startlingly clear. He told her she was strong. Sarah stared at him, utterly speechless, her mind reeling. He had spoken, and not in anger, not in threat. He then tended to her injured leg, with even more meticulous care than usual, carefully unwrapping the crude splint. He examined the swollen, discolored limb with a focused intensity, his touch surprisingly knowledgeable, almost like that of a healer. From a small, beaded pouch, he took out a different kind of leaf than he had used before, which he crushed between his fingers and mixed with the little water from the basket to make a thick, fragrant poultice. As he gently applied the cool mixture to her hot, inflamed skin, the sensation was a blessed, instant relief. This, he explained, helped. His grandmother, he added softly, had showed him. His grandmother? A Comanche warrior, an outcast perhaps, judging by his solitude. Speaking of his grandmother, tending to an injured white woman with traditional native remedies. The deeply ingrained assumptions Sarah had carried with her for her entire life, the unthinking, pervasive prejudices of her world, began to crumble, to disintegrate like dry earth in a storm. This man, this Kael, was not the bloodthirsty demon of settler nightmares. He was something else entirely, something far more complex, far more human. He had saved her life, not for ransom, not for sport, not for any reason she could fathom, but seemingly out of some deeply ingrained personal code, some hidden, unexpected wellspring of compassion that defied every single expectation she had ever held. The twist, she realized with a jolt, wasn't some sudden, violent betrayal or a dark, sinister secret revealed about him. The true twist was the slow, dawning, profound realization in Sarah's own heart that the stark, unyielding lines between enemy and savior, between so-called savage and so-called civilized, were not nearly as clearly drawn, not as absolute, as she had always, unquestioningly believed. The true nature of this lone Comanche was not one of inherent brutality, but of a quiet, startling, and utterly unexpected humanity. They remained in the sanctuary of the hidden canyon for several more days. Kael hunted silently, leaving Sarah by the small, carefully tended fire within the cave. He would return with meager but life-sustaining offerings, A couple of plump quail one day, more edible roots dug from the stubborn earth another. He showed her which wild plants were safe to eat, which ones, when crushed and applied as a salve, could ease the persistent ache in her bruises and strains. He resplinted her leg with fresh, pliable branches, more carefully and expertly this time, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that were clearly accustomed to the harshness of daily survival and, undoubtedly, the brutal realities of conflict. He spoke very little, but when he did, it was in that same broken, heavily accented English, usually to point out something of interest, a red-tailed hawk circling lazily high overhead, the faint, distant track of a deer imprinted in the soft earth near the spring. Sarah, in turn, slowly found her own voice again. She told him her name, Sarah. He repeated it slowly, thoughtfully, as if tasting the sound of it. Sarah. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips, there and gone as quickly as it appeared. She learned his name was Kael. She didn't ask about his tribe, or why he was so utterly alone out here in the vast wilderness. The questions felt intrusive, disrespectful, perhaps even dangerous. Their communication was sparse, unconventional, built upon shared gestures, understanding glances, and the quiet, steady rhythm of daily survival in their isolated refuge. A fragile, unspoken understanding bloomed slowly in the quiet confines of their hidden shelter, a precarious bond forged in shared hardship, mutual vulnerability, and Kael's unexpected, life-altering kindness. Her leg began to mend, the angry swelling gradually reducing, the fiery, intense pain dulling to a more manageable, persistent ache. She found she could put a little weight on it now, with the continued help of her sturdy crutch. The hidden canyon began to feel like a true sanctuary, a temporary haven, a place somehow outside the harsh, brutal realities of the wider world. But Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that it couldn't last. She was a white woman, he a Comanche warrior. Their respective worlds were locked in bitter, violent conflict, even if, in this small, hidden, forgotten place, they had somehow found a temporary, fragile truce. The confrontation, when it inevitably came, was not between them. It arrived on a bright morning when the air was crisp and startlingly clear, carrying sound for miles across the open plains. Kael was away from the canyon, checking snares he had meticulously set further down the narrow defile. Sarah was by the spring, carefully refilling the woven waterskin, when she heard it, the unmistakable, metallic jingle of cavalry tack, the low, indistinct murmur of men's voices approaching. Her blood ran cold, turning to ice in her veins. Soldiers. They were close. Far too close. She scrambled as quickly as her injured leg would allow back towards the relative safety of the cave, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped drum. If they found her here, with Kael, they would instantly assume the worst. They would see only a terrified captive and a savage captor. There would be no questions asked, she knew, only the swift, brutal language of gunfire. Kael appeared at the narrow mouth of the canyon almost simultaneously, materializing from the rocks and shadows as if summoned by her silent, desperate fear. His dark eyes were narrowed, his powerful body coiled and tense. He had heard them too. He looked at Sarah, then quickly towards the cave. He gestured urgently for her to hide, to stay absolutely silent. But before she could react, before she could even move, 3 blue-coated soldiers rode into full view at the canyon entrance, their rifles held ready, their faces hard and suspicious. Their leader, a grizzled, weather-beaten sergeant with wary, narrowed eyes and a thick, drooping mustache, spotted Kael immediately. He drawled out, his voice laced with undisguised contempt, asking what they had there, that it looked like they had found themselves a redskin. Kael stood his ground, silent, motionless, watchful as a hawk. His hand rested lightly, almost casually, near the hilt of the long knife at his belt. The soldiers fanned out slightly, their rifles aimed directly at Kael's chest. Another soldier, younger, with a nervous, twitchy energy about him, barked out a challenge, demanding what the Comanche was doing on this land. Kael said nothing, his silence a potent, defiant force. Sarah knew, with a sickening certainty, this was how it always started. Misunderstanding, ingrained fear, escalating prejudice, and then, inevitably, senseless violence. She had to do something. Anything. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she deliberately stepped out from behind the large rock where she'd started to conceal herself, leaning heavily on her crutch for support. She called out, her voice raspy from disuse, but surprisingly clear and strong, telling them to wait. The soldiers whirled around at her unexpected appearance, clearly surprised. Their rifle barrels wavered for a brief, crucial moment. The sergeant's eyes widened in disbelief when he saw her, a white woman, disheveled, her leg crudely splinted, clearly injured, in the company of a lone Comanche. He stammered, asking what in tarnation was going on, if she was all right, if this savage had taken her. Sarah looked from the sergeant's hard, suspicious face to Kael's impassive, unreadable one. This was the moment, the fulcrum upon which lives might turn. She stated firmly, her voice gaining strength and conviction, that no, he hadn't taken her. He had, in fact, saved her. The sergeant frowned, his skepticism palpable. Saved her from what? He demanded. Sarah explained as calmly as she could, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, about her horse falling, her broken leg, how she had been trapped. He found me, she emphasized. He freed me, splinted my leg, and brought me to this sheltered place. He's been helping me survive. The soldiers exchanged openly skeptical, disdainful glances. The younger, nervous one sneered, asking if he was helping her, ma'am, or just keeping her for later. Kael's eyes, which had been fixed with unwavering intensity on the sergeant, flicked sharply to the younger soldier. A dangerous, warning light flared briefly in their dark depths, but he remained otherwise perfectly still, a coiled spring of controlled power. Sarah insisted, her gaze locking fiercely with the sergeant's, that Kael had shared his meager food with her, his precious water. He had tended her injury with care. Without him, she stated with absolute certainty, she would have died out there on the plains. The sergeant seemed to hesitate, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his weathered face. He looked at Sarah's obviously splinted leg, at her worn, exhausted face, then back at Kael, who still hadn't moved or spoken a single word in his own defense. There was a long, heavy, tense silence, broken only by the nervous stamping of one of the cavalry horses and the distant cry of a hawk. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction that surprised even herself, pointing directly at Kael. This man, she declared, is not your enemy. Not today. He showed me mercy, when he had every reason, every right not to. The sergeant chewed thoughtfully on the ends of his thick mustache. He looked at Kael again, a long, hard, searching look. Kael met his gaze directly, unflinching, his own stare steady and unwavering. Perhaps it was Sarah's undeniable earnestness, the ring of truth in her voice, or perhaps the sergeant saw something in Kael's quiet, stoic dignity that gave him pause. Or maybe, just maybe, a forgotten flicker of his own buried humanity stirred within him. He finally said, lowering his rifle slightly, "That all right, ma'am. They take her word for it for now." He then gestured to his men, telling them to lower their weapons. The suffocating tension in the small canyon eased, but only slightly. The payoff wasn't a dramatic hail of bullets or a heroic, last-minute rescue. It was something far quieter, more nuanced, and ultimately more profound. It was the quiet triumph of a single, courageous voice, Sarah's voice, cutting through thick, suffocating layers of ingrained prejudice and primal fear. It was Kael, standing his ground not with overt aggression, but with a silent, unshakable dignity that spoke volumes louder than any rifle shot. And it was the grudging, uncertain, but nevertheless present acknowledgment from the soldiers that perhaps, just perhaps, things were not always as black and white, not always as they seemed, on this harsh, unforgiving, and morally ambiguous frontier. The sergeant, whose name, Sarah learned, was Miller, still regarded Kael with a deep, lingering suspicion, but Sarah's continued, passionate insistence, coupled with the undeniable, stark evidence of her severe injury and Kael's rudimentary, but clearly effective care, seemed to gradually wear down his initial, aggressive hostility. He reluctantly agreed to escort Sarah back towards the nearest fledgling settlement, a small, dusty collection of rough-hewn cabins, hopefully called Redemption, which lay a hard, grueling day's ride to the east. Before they prepared to leave the sanctuary of the hidden canyon, Sarah turned to Kael. The soldiers watched them, their expressions a curious mixture of lingering distrust and a dawning, grudging respect. Words felt utterly inadequate, hollow. How could she possibly thank a man who had not only saved her physical life, but had also fundamentally, irrevocably changed her entire understanding of the world and its people? She simply looked at him, meeting his dark, steady, unreadable gaze. She said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears, "Thank you, Kael, for everything." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in response, his eyes holding no easily discernible emotion. Yet she felt a powerful connection, a silent, profound acknowledgement of the extraordinary ordeal they had shared, the unlikely bond they had forged. He handed her the rifle he had carried for her all this time, and her small, precious saddlebag of meager belongings. The soldiers, with surprising gentleness, helped her onto one of their spare horses, a slow, awkward, and painful process. As they prepared to ride out of the canyon, Sergeant Miller looked back at Kael, who still stood silently by the cave entrance, a stoic, solitary figure watching them depart. Miller advised the Comanche, his voice gruff but notably lacking its earlier menace, that he'd best make himself scarce, as next time they might not be so inclined to listen to stories. Kael offered no reply, no gesture, simply melting back into the deep shadows of the canyon like a phantom as they rode away, leaving him to his solitude. The journey to Redemption was an arduous, painful trial for Sarah. Every jolt of the horse, every uneven step, sent sharp, stabbing pains through her still-mending leg. But the acute physical discomfort was largely overshadowed by the profound turmoil in her mind, the whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. She replayed the incredible events of the past weeks over and over in her memory. Kael's quiet, unassuming competence, his unexpected, almost unbelievable acts of kindness, the selfless way he had shared his meager, precious resources without question or hesitation. When they finally reached Redemption, a dusty, unremarkable collection of rough-hewn wooden buildings huddled together on the vast plain, the sight of familiar faces, of women in faded calico dresses and men in worn denim trousers, brought a complex, overwhelming wave of emotions. Relief, certainly, deep and profound, but also a strange, unsettling sense of dislocation, of no longer quite belonging. She was back in her own world, among her own people, but she was no longer the same person who had ridden out from her isolated homestead those many weeks ago. Her story, when she haltingly told parts of it to the curious and concerned settlers, was met with a predictable mixture of shock, outright disbelief, and from some of the more hardened and prejudiced individuals, open hostility towards the very idea of a Comanche warrior showing such unexpected mercy to a white woman. But Sarah held firm, her resolve steeled by her experience. She spoke of Kael's actions, not as those of a savage, as many were quick to label him, but as those of a man, a human being, a man who had, for reasons she might never fully comprehend, chosen compassion over cruelty, kindness over brutality, in a situation where he held all the power. In the weeks and months that followed, as her leg slowly, painstakingly healed under the more practiced and conventional care of a woman in the settlement known for her skill with herbal remedies, Sarah found herself looking off into the west, towards the vast, empty, windswept plains where Kael roamed, a solitary figure in an immense landscape. The world felt different to her now, its familiar boundaries less certain, its possibilities somehow wider, more nuanced. The deep-seated fear she had once felt of the unknown, Uncharted spaces on the map had been profoundly tempered, softened by the certain knowledge that even in the deepest, most forbidding wilderness, even in the very heart of what her people considered enemy territory, true humanity could be found, could flourish. She eventually returned to her small, isolated homestead. The daily work was harder now, more challenging with her. Still mending leg, but she faced it with a new, quiet resolve, a deeper, more resilient strength she hadn't possessed before. The profound silence of the prairie no longer felt so empty, so threatening, so desolate. It was filled now, in her mind's eye, with the vivid, enduring memory of a quiet, enigmatic warrior, a man who had defied all her ingrained expectations, all her learned prejudices. She never saw Kael again. But sometimes, when the wind blew strong and true from the west, carrying with it the clean, evocative scent of distant rain and wild, crushed sage, she would feel a profound, almost mystical sense of connection, a silent, heartfelt reminder of the unlikely, unforgettable bond forged in shared pain, mutual desperation, and unexpected grace. The frontier was still a harsh, demanding, and often unforgiving place, but Sarah carried within her now a new, hard-won understanding that courage, compassion, and honor were not qualities confined to one people or one creed. They were precious, resilient flowers that could, against all odds, bloom in the most desolate of landscapes, in the most unexpected, and often the most feared of hearts. And that hard-won peace she now possessed, that quiet, unshakable strength that radiated from her, was a living testament to the lone Comanche who had shown her mercy when she was entirely, helplessly, at his